the music isn't too loud because it feels really loud in my ears. I might turn it down a little bit, like the actual video itself, not what you guys hear. Like turn it down for me. There we go. Happy New Year, everyone. Sorry I didn't stream earlier in the year, but it is what it is. I wanted some time to chill at home before coming back up for college, and then subsequently spend some time like just settling in college. But I figured it's been a while since we last read Through a Glass Divine, and I figured, why not? So, I say, without further ado, let's get into it. Hold on. There's like a pink pulsating dot above my chat settings. I want to see what that's about. Later. Okay, just now Stream Elements puts the command in. That's crazy. Anyway. I think the muffled words in this, lo-fi playlist is gonna throw me off sometimes, but hey, that's fine. That's all good. Okay, let me do this, and let me do that. There we go, we're back in business, baby. Also, sorry I was like 10 minutes late to stream. I forgot that changing your password on Twitch, also changes your stream key. And, I pressed the go live button at like 9:01. And it said, you have the wrong stream key, and I couldn't remember how to get it. So, it took me a while to figure that out, but luckily I did. You can tell I haven't streamed in a while. Okay, it's been 17 days, but I haven't consistently streamed in a while. Ooh. I briefly skimmed chapter 16 to see if I forgot anything. And from what I remember, what happened in the last chapter was Tommy and Wilbur, or the Pythia, went to the surface to eat some food or something at a marketplace. And it was like a test to see if Wilbur would actually leave, and he chose to stay. Because he is kidnapped after all. He was technically kidnapped by Tommy and the Deathlings after all, but he chose to stay. Because he realized he lived a better life with the Deathlings than he did in the palace. So we're slowly but surely potentially getting Wilbur out of the whole being a prophet, Clara's this divine being kind of person, kind of thing. Because it's obvious that Clara is just a phony. Now, how the visions work, I still have no idea. But I'm sure we'll figure that out as we go. Maybe not in this chapter. Probably not in this chapter. But, yeah. I'm still really worried that the music is too loud. So I'm just gonna turn it down more. Because it's loud for me in my ears, so I don't know if it's the same for you guys or not. Because if the music is too loud, you won't be able to hear me. So how about I turn myself up? Okay, that should be good. I'm just worried about, like, if I turn my mic up too much, you'll get, if there's ever, like, really intense moments where I start shouting, which is unlikely for this chapter, hopefully, then it'll, like, peak my mic, and nobody likes that. Nobody wants to hear that. Okay. Let's see. For those of you that don't know, Through a Glass Divine is a SBI-centered AU fanfic written by Bones and the Bees. I think when I'm done with this story, I think Bones and the Bees has written QSMP fics. So I might look at those because Bones and the Bees is a really talented writer, and I adore her music, writing. All right, let me drink some water real quick. All right. Chapter 17, Stars of the Dead. Summary: Tommy's rule breaking has consequences. Trigger warnings for this chapter: mentions of blood, minor injuries, stitching up a wound, and very minor self-harm in the name of religious worship. So if any of those things trigger you in any way, please take care of yourselves first. Do whatever you need to do in those moments. It'll probably give you I'm hoping it'll give you a little bit of warning as, like, the in terms of foreshadowing and writing. But if it doesn't, I always read the stories paragraph by paragraph like this, with the paragraph I'm reading being at the bottom of the screen. So if you see something potentially coming up, you will be given plenty of diligence. I hope. Is that even the word? Diligence? Whatever. When they got back from the night market, Wilbur and Tommy stumbled down the stairs while giggling to each other, drunk on the adrenaline of the hover bike ride. In all honesty, for Wilbur the adrenaline came from more places than just the hover bike. It was also the thrill of being outside, without being drugged out of his mind, for the first time in years. It was from the nerves still humming in his veins because of the choice he'd had to make. It was the rush of relief buzzing under his skin when he decided he was going to stay unless Clara told him otherwise. And, well, his head was throbbing from smacking that sign, so a bit of his energy was probably coming from that too. Wilbur knew that when the next morning came, he would be worried about 1,000 different things again. His choice would have ramifications he couldn't ignore forever, but he could ignore them for now. He could let himself relax into the knowledge that he wasn't going to be leaving the Deathlings anytime soon. That he wasn't going to be separated from Tommy anytime soon. They reached the bottom of the stairwell, and Wilbur slumped against Tommy as he unlocked the vault door. Tommy grumbled at his weight, but this only made Wilbur lean further on him, resting his chin on top of Tommy's head while Tommy struggled to stay upright. You trying to fall asleep on me or some shit? Tommy, it's been a while since I've tried to do voice acting. Yikes! Yikes! What was that sentence? Anyway, you trying to fall asleep on me or some shit? Tommy huffed, making both of them step back from the keypad. Maybe, Wilbur mumbled, having shut his eyes despite the fact that the stairwell was nearly pitch black already. A good pillow. You're literally standing up, Tommy pointed out, grunting as he yanked open the door. You gonna sleep standing up? Like a horse? How do you know that horses sleep standing up? Wilbur asked, resting his arms over Tommy's chest as the two of them squeezed through the crack in the door. Read a book on it once because I wanted to know what real horses are like and not like holograms, Tommy explained, pivoting them both around so he could shut the vault door as quietly as possible behind them. Both of their voices had dropped the moment Tommy had opened the door. Although it was late and they weren't expecting to run into anyone, Wilbur was very aware of how bad this would look if someone found out they had snuck out. Not only was Tommy still under punishment, but all it would take was a quick call upstairs for the others to realize they hadn't gone to Quackity's, meaning they would all know Tommy had taken Wilbur outside. But the main chamber of the temple was empty. Wilbur detached himself from Tommy, but Tommy immediately grabbed his hand, and the two crept back towards their rooms while playing a silent game of trying to squeeze the other's fingers hard enough to make them cry out in pain. Tommy started it, for the record. Wilbur was just glad it was Tommy's flesh and bone hand that he was holding this time, because he was pretty sure Tommy's prosthetic could break his fingers if he really went for it. Luck was on their side as they made their way back to Wilbur's room without issue. He pushed open the door himself, turning around to drag Tommy in behind him. But when he glanced back, he saw Tommy's eyes had gone wide and were focused on something over his shoulder. There was the sound of someone clearing their throat. Clenching his jaw, he tugged Tommy into the room and let the door slam shut, the pit reopening in his gut as all of their luck dissipated into thin air. Did you two have fun? Phil asked, his voice tight. He stood in the center of the room, his eyes like chips of ice as he looked the two of them up and down. First, he focused on Tommy, who shrunk back as soon as Phil's gaze landed on him. Then, his focus switched, and the Pythia felt horribly exposed as Phil locked onto his eyes despite the blindfold. Phil, don't even start, Phil snapped, cutting Tommy off. I've been put through the fucking emotional ringer over the past hour, so I don't have any patience for bullshit right now. I know you were at Quackity's bar, so don't try to pull that. I'm going to ask where you were and what you did, and you're going to answer the questions in a way that doesn't make my headache worse than it already is. Got it? Despite the fact that he was clearly talking to Tommy, Phil's eyes were still locked onto the Pythia. The Pythia wanted the pit in his gut to swallow him whole. Got it? Tommy answered in a strangely quiet voice. Phil nodded, narrowing his eyes at the Pythia before finally looking at Tommy again. You left the temple, yes? Yes. Tommy nodded. They were still holding hands, and Tommy was squeezing the Pythia's fingers hard enough to make them go numb. Where did you go? The night market. With the Pythia? Yes. The Pythia winced at this, but Phil didn't seem surprised. If anything, His face was completely unreadable at the moment. The narrowed eyes and tension in his shoulders suggested anger, but there was something deeper carved into the lines of his face. Something heavier. At any point in the night, did you leave him alone? Squeezing his eyes shut, the Pythia let out a slow breath from his nose. Tommy squeezed his fingers again before answering. I did. I left him alone at a table while I went to go get our food. Tommy answered, his words shaky. Phil's gaze flickered back to him. And yet you're still here. One of the tattoos on Phil's arm caught the Pythia's eye. A moth with its wings pinned down, like it was trapped. Sorry about that. Right then, the Pythia felt exactly like that moth, pinned to the wall, unable to move. I knew he wasn't gonna run. Did anyone follow you back? Phil asked, cutting Tommy off again. Tommy scowled. Of course not. I wouldn't have come back here if we'd been fucking followed. No trackers were put on your bike. Phil pushed. You know I have an alarm system on it for that. But did you check? Obviously I fucking checked, Tommy exclaimed, his voice rising now. I'm not that much of an idiot, Phil. I wouldn't risk that. The Pythia didn't miss how Tommy wasn't mentioning the man he'd bumped into when throwing out their trash. Phil huffed. How the fuck am I supposed to know that when you take the Pythia out, who we've been holding captive for months, and leave him alone at a goddamn night market? Nothing happened, though, Tommy argued, letting go of the Pythia's hand now so he could gesture at him. Look! He's right here! I didn't get arrested, we didn't get followed. It's fine. The raised eyebrow Phil was sending their way told the Pythia he wasn't so sure. You still broke the rules of your punishment, Phil pointed out after nearly a minute of silence. That's the least of your worries right now, because you put the entirety of the Deathlings in danger with this stunt. Phil's voice had gone dangerously low now, and a chill ran down the Pythia's spine. Tommy's face crumpled. But I knew. I wouldn't have said anything, he chimed in, heart pounding in his chest as those ice-cold eyes fell on him again. I know that, you have no reason to trust me, but even if I had made a run for it, which I didn't, but still, I wouldn't have told them where you were. While that's a sweet sentiment, that's not the point. The point is that Tommy put us all at risk. He paused and shifted his whole body to face Tommy. Techno and I are gonna have a talk with you in the morning, alright? swallowing down a lump in his throat. Tommy nodded. Shit. Okay. Seemingly satisfied at Tommy's agreement, Phil glanced at the shared door between their rooms. Then, he gave Tommy an expectant look. Tommy frowned. Are you sending me to my room? Yep. Phil! What if I want to stay and talk with my friend? Tommy exclaimed, brushing past his near slip-up without so much as a second blink. Consider this you being grounded, Phil told him, oblivious to what Tommy had almost said. But, Tom? Tommy fell silent at Phil's sharp tone. His eyes darted between Phil and the Pythia, before taking a reluctant step towards his door. It was my idea, though, Tommy then clarified, resting his hand on the door handle. Don't blame him for it or anything. Of course, Tommy was more worried about Phil blaming him than for his own impending punishment. For as stupid as he could be, Tommy could also be too sweet for his own good when it came down to it. Phil made a shooing gesture with his hands. Seriously, Tommy, get. Sparing one last look at the Pythia, Tommy sighed and hurried through the door, letting it slam shut behind him. And just like that, the Pythia was alone with Phil. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The Pythia waited again for the questions he knew Phil wanted to ask. The questions he was still asking himself. Anxiety curled at his gut, and he looked longingly at the door Tommy had just left through. He really wished Phil had let him stay, but he also understood why Phil would want to talk to him alone after that. The seconds ticked on. Then a minute passed. Phil stepped forward, and the Pythia flinched. Hey, don't need to be so jumpy, mate, Phil said in a much softer voice than the one he'd been using on Tommy. No, it wasn't your idea to leave. The Pythia clenched his jaw. That's not what I'm worried about. Oh? Phil cocked his head to the side in that bird-like fashion again. What is it then? Pushing his hands through his hair, the Pythia had to fight the urge to shrug. Questions, I guess? I know you have questions, but I don't really know if I have the answers I want to give you right now. Phil was silent for a moment. The Pythia risked a glance up again, and was surprised to see him genuinely considering that instead of being annoyed. While I do have questions, don't think I'm gonna get much from interrogating you right now, Phil finally said. If anything, I'm more worried about the blood on your forehead. The Pythia froze. Blood? Yeah, you got some blood on the edge of your blindfold. Your hair is covering it a bit, so I can't tell, but... The Pythia reached up to push his hair back, and Phil's eyes widened. Oh, I see it. Your eyebrow's fucked up. Frowning, the Pythia reached up to touch his eyebrows, and hissed when a sharp pain flashed through the right side of his face. What the fuck? He whispered, staring at the dried blood now stuck to his fingertips. Did you hit your head or something while you were out? Phil asked, taking another step towards him. This time, the Pythia didn't flinch. Yeah, I did. When we were leaving the night market, I ran into a sign because I wasn't looking where I was going. He brought his fingers up to his face again, more gently this time as he prodded at the dried blood. I didn't notice this, though. The adrenaline probably kept it from hurting, Phil pointed out, taking another step forward so they were face to face. Can you pull down your blindfold just a bit so I can get a better look? As carefully as he could, the Pythia tugged down one edge of his blindfold, just enough to show his entire eyebrow while still keeping his eyes covered. Phil let out a hiss between his teeth. I'm not an expert, but I think that's gonna need at least a stitch or two. You sure? He asked, tugging the blindfold back up and wincing when it made the cut sting. It's late. I don't want to wake Punk up if we don't have to. Well, we don't need to wake him up. I've done my fair share of sutures over the years. Over the years, Phil explained, walking towards the door leading out of the room. I'll go grab the kit out of the infirmary. Don't try to talk to Tommy. Don't try to talk to Tommy while I'm gone. Without thinking, the Pythia huffed out a what? Will ground me too? Phil gave him a flat stare. Yes. With that, he walked out into the hallway, leaving the Pythia alone. Although his eyes darted to the shared door between his and Tommy's rooms, he didn't want to try and knock after Phil had explicitly told him not to. Maybe it was because he knew that Tommy really shouldn't have undermined his punishment like that. Or maybe it was just because he didn't want to push Phil's patience more than it already had been that night. Either way, after a beat, the Pythia sat down on the edge of his bed without making any moves towards the shared door. One second. Before stream, I cut a tag off my shirt because it was bothering me, but now there's still a part of it that's like exposed. I'm gonna try and cut it off without ruining the stitching. So that's one thing you run the risk of when cutting off tags or ripping them off, is ruining the stitching of the shirt. I think I might be doing that anyway. Okay, if that's not better, I'm going to claw my eyes out. Okay. While he waited, he unzipped the jacket Tommy had given him, tossing it to the side before pulling one of his softest sweaters back over his head. He took care to make sure the fabric didn't brush against his eyebrow, which was starting to throb now that he had noticed the cut. Exhaustion tugged at the edges of his mind. So much had happened in the span of a single day. From his fight with Tommy that morning, to his conversation with Tubbo outside the bathhouse, and then everything that came with going out to the night market. He tried not to think about his conversation with Tommy after he decided not to run. To not see the pain plainly written across Tommy's face when he pointed out how it hurt to give up his name and accept that he wasn't a person. But the adrenaline from before had burnt away like fog in sunlight, so there was nothing to distract him from it anymore. The conflicting emotions that had been swirling around the inside of his chest had finally settled into something that wasn't overwhelming, but carried a weight with it that he couldn't ignore. It would have been so much easier if he felt hollow, but instead, he felt far too full. Full of quiet aches and confusing thoughts he wasn't supposed to have. Nausea pressed against the back of his throat. At least he'd already eaten dinner. The door to his room opened again, making him jump as Phil pushed his way inside. He held a first aid kit in his hands, along with a dark washcloth and a glass of water. The Pythia stayed still as Phil approached the bed, crouching down in front of him to set the items on the ground. "Drink this," Phil ordered, shoving the glass in his hands. "Tommy's nearly passed out from dehydration before, and you've already lost some blood, so I'm assuming you probably need it." As soon as Phil said that, the Pythia became acutely aware of how dry his throat was. He reached for the glass without argument, eyes widening as he took the first sip and realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd had water that day. He drank half the glass in a single go. When he set it down again, he had to take a breath and wiped a few stray droplets off his chin with the back of his hand. "Thanks," he muttered. Glancing up again, he noticed Phil loading a syringe with clear liquid from a vial. "You sure you know how to do this?" Phil pulled the syringe out of the vial and gave the Pythia an unamused look. Believe it or not, injuries still happen whether or not you have a healer in your group. While Techno's a bit better at the medical stuff than I am, I've had to stitch him up more times than I can count, so I've had my fair share of practice. "Oh, that made sense. Sorry, I just wasn't sure," the Pythia said, wrapping his arms around himself. "It's fine. Though you might have a bit of a scar since I never learned the proper technique to make things look nice." The Pythia thought back to the scars that used to litter his body before he'd been taken to the palace. How strange it had been when the healers had taken their glittering creams and erased them all with a few swipes. He could feel the thin scar on his scalp from the staples Ponk had put in his head. But Tommy had assured him it wasn't visible. This would be different. A scar through his eyebrow would be plain for the world to see. In a way, it would be physical evidence of how his time with the Deathings had changed him. And maybe that should have upset him, but it didn't. "I don't mind," he said softly. Still holding the syringe, Phil smiled. "Alright then, hold still so I can..." He cut himself off as his eyes flickered to the Pythia's face again. "What?" Phil frowned. "It's gonna be difficult to stitch you up with that blindfold in the way." Shit. Oh, of course it was. Even if he could tug the blindfold down so it was still covering his eyes, he would have to hold it like that the entire time Phil was stitching his face. It'd be awkward for Phil to work around, And there wasn't a lot of room for error, considering how close the cut was to his actual eye. Look. I know you got, like, rules and shit about not showing your face to people, but surely there are exceptions when it comes to getting medical attention, right? Phil asked, furrowing his brows. Phil didn't know that Tommy had already seen him without the blindfold, but even if he hadn't, there was an understanding that it was fine to ignore certain taboos when it came to the health of the Pythia. Even if the healers were terrified of being cursed, they had a duty to ensure Claire's vessel was able to perform his duties no matter what. But Phil didn't owe him that. And while Tommy might have trusted him, Phil certainly had no reason to. You know about the curse, the Pythia said, after a long stretch of silence. I do, yeah, Phil shrugged, not looking the least bit concerned. I have my own questions about it, considering death is Kristen's domain and not Clara's, but I'm not worried about it regardless. Why not? Phil snorted. Mate, I've put my full trust into the goddess of death for decades now. You really think I'm worried about dying early? Well, you had a point there. Even if you're not worried, I am, the Pythia argued. And just close your eyes, Phil said, almost in the exact same way Tommy had. The pit was still there. It was yawning and cavernous as he realized there was no reason for him not to take the blindfold off right now. Unlike with Tommy, this wouldn't be breaking a taboo since it was for medical treatment. Phil wasn't worried about the curse. For all intents and purposes, this should have been easier than taking off the blindfold in front of Tommy. Yet, the Pythia's heart was pounding in his chest again, and he wasn't sure why. Phil waited for him to make a decision. The syringe was still in his hand, a drop of liquid bubbling at the top as the seconds ticked on. Then the Pythia swallowed the nausea and shut his eyes as he lifted his hands to his head. The silk rested in his palms after he untied it. With his eyes shut, the Pythia didn't miss Phil's sharp intake of breath, and tried to shove down the anxiety twisting in his gut as he waited for the other to say something. A few beats passed. Alright? Phil finally said, coughing awkwardly to clear his throat. I'm gonna numb the area, so you'll feel a small pinch by your eye, okay? Although the Pythia was desperate to know why Phil had paused for so long after seeing his face, he simply nodded, and tried not to flinch when Phil's free hand grabbed his chin to hold his head still. After a quick swipe of the disinfectant, he only felt a brief sting from the needle before anesthetic flooded the side of his face. Phil waited a few moments, tapping the skin around his eyebrow and asking if he could feel it. Once he stopped feeling Phil's fingers, that was the cue to move forward. So, Phil began while the Pythia distantly felt his skin being tugged. Okay, now I feel like the music is too loud. Hold on. Turn it down more. There we go. Should be slightly better. Okay. You know there's been a lot of shit going on in the past week. The Pythia huffed, the anxiety buzzing under his skin slowly fading out as the seconds ticked by. That's an understatement. Yeah, I suppose it is. The tugging sensation faded even more, even though the Pythia could hear Phil's hands moving in front of his face. Sorry I never checked how you were doing after that shit with Jack. Oh. It's fine, the Pythia said, not having expected Phil to bring that up. You've had your own shit to deal with. Phil sighed. That's certainly the fucking truth. More seconds ticked by. There was a sound of scissors snipping something before Phil reached up to presumably start another suture. The Pythia was still struggling to wrap his head around how relaxed Phil seemed to be, despite the danger he was in. He could open his eyes at any moment, but Phil had put his full trust into Kristen. His breathing was even, and his stitches were slow but confident. He wasn't worried in the slightest, and the Pythia found himself wondering if he could ever have that kind of unwavering trust in Clara. He was supposed to have that trust, but he didn't. There hadn't been a single vision from her since his failure to escape. Although that was probably a punishment for his failure, he didn't think it was exactly fair for her to give up on him after a single try. Of course, he was staying here of his own free will now, but like he'd thought to himself at the night market, if she wanted him back, she would have to tell him herself. Either way, she hadn't been there for him during some of the most terrifying moments of his life. The former Pythia would call him childish and petty for being upset about that, but he couldn't bring himself to care anymore. Yes, Clara was a goddess whose concerns rose far above the mortal realm, but he was her vessel. He'd think that she wouldn't abandon him at the first sign of trouble. Something tight wrapped around his chest, and he struggled to keep his breathing even as he imagined Phil's suturing needle puncturing his skin again. Tommy was right. Giving up his name had hurt him. And it didn't matter because that's what he was meant to do. That was the purpose of his existence. But he wanted it to matter. Or at least, he wanted to know his sacrifices weren't made in vain. Can I ask you something, Phil? The Pythia asked after several minutes of silence. Phil paused. Sure. Sure. A beat passed. Have you ever had to do something in Kristen's name that you didn't want to do? Silence stretched out between them again. Phil resumed his suturing, and the Pythia tried not to focus on the faint tugging against his eye. I'm happy to serve my goddess, Phil said after a few moments. So no, I've never done something for her I didn't want to do. The Pythia resisted the urge to frown. I meant, well, I guess a better way to phrase it is, has she ever asked you to do something that would hurt you? Hi, Bee! Hello! Right now, there's, descriptions of, Wilbur getting stitches in his eyebrow. So if that makes you uncomfortable in any way, please take care of yourself first. And apparently, according to the trigger warnings at the beginning of this chapter, it's not bad. He just like hit in the previous chapter. He hit his head on like a road sign or something. It's not bad, but I know how it can make people uncomfortable, like the imagery of like stitches and stuff. Also, I was reading out the trigger warnings like I always do at the beginning of the chapter, and it said something about like minor self-harm, but it was like in a religious context. I don't know if they actually do it or if it's like mentions of minor self-harm, you know? And I feel like we're getting close to that. I feel like we're getting close to that in the story. Because Wilbur's asking Phil, or the Pythia is asking Phil if Kristen ever asked him to do something that would hurt him. And, based on how that conversation's going, I'm starting to think something happened with the Pythia. Wouldn't be surprised. No. Phil's not doing it. Phil's not or we'll see how this goes. I'm just gonna keep reading. Let's see. Well, I guess a better way to phrase it is, has she ever asked you to do something that would hurt you? No, of course. Why'd I go Scottish? 1 second. No, of course not. Phil answered immediately. Of course I would serve Kristen in any way she requires of me, but I know her. She would never ask me to do something if it went against my values or would harm me in any serious way. But you mentioned you've used your own blood as an offering to her before. The Pythia pointed out. Yes, but she never asked me to do that. I started doing it on my own after I realized using my blood as an offering lets her feel closer to the living. Phil explained. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, never mind. I was completely wrong. I totally forgot that Phil mentioned he's done that before. Phil explained, his tone having shifted to something not quite sharp, but not friendly either. Besides, it's usually little more than a few drops of blood from my finger. I'd never hurt myself in any serious way for her, because I know she wouldn't appreciate that. The Pythia considered this for a moment. Also, I've been really paranoid about, like, the audio levels for the stream, so let me know if the music is too quiet or too loud, or if I'm too quiet or too loud. Because I don't really realize that until I look through the VOD. The Pythia considered this for a moment. What about mentally, though? At this, Phil's movements paused again. What? When I asked if she'd ask you to do something that hurt you, I didn't just mean physically. I meant mentally as well. He explained, remembering the way it felt like a searing brand had been taken to his chest the first time Tommy had called him Wilbur. Again, Phil resumed the stitches. There was another gentle tug followed by the telltale snip of scissors, before Phil dropped both his hands from the Pythia's face. Do you mean like being asked to give up my name? He winced, although it felt odd with half of his face being numb. Yes, he admitted in a low voice, like that. There was a sound of paper being ripped from a bandage, and suddenly Phil's hands were on his face again, covering up the stitches on his eyebrow to keep them clean. No, she'd never asked me to do something that would hurt me like that, Phil answered, smoothing out the bandage with his thumbs. Phil's hands were rough, calloused skin pulled against his own, and while it should have been uncomfortable, for some reason he found himself leaning into the comforting touch anyway. Before he could push too far into Phil's hands, though, the hands pulled away, and he forced himself to straighten back up before Phil noticed. Another silence fell over them. He knew he should have put his blindfold back on since the stitches were done, but as he twisted the silk between his fingers, he found he didn't have the energy to bring it back up to his head. So he kept his eyes shut and wondered if he could actually feel Phil's eyes roaming over his face, or if he was just imagining it. After another minute, Phil spoke again. There's something I want to show you, but I think it's best if we wait till tomorrow for it. I'm sure you're tired after today. He listened as Phil gathered up his supplies to put back into the first aid kit, keeping his eyes shut as the blindfold sat limp in his palms. Although he didn't have the slightest clue what Phil would want to show him, he couldn't bring himself to do anything but hum in acknowledgement. The last of his anxiety had faded out, leaving him exhausted as he mulled over how different Kristen seemed to Clara. In a way, it was almost ironic. Clara was the goddess of all living things. Kristen was the goddess of death. One goddess asked her vessel to do things that hurt to show their dedication. The other never asked for pain, even when her followers were more willing to prove themselves to her in any way they could. All right, he nodded, keeping his eyes shut as he slumped back against his pillows. You know where to find me. Phil snorted at this. Yeah, I suppose I do. He heard the door open and waited for the following sound of it shutting so he could open his eyes. The seconds ticked by. He could feel Phil staring at him again. And then the door finally shut, and he breathed a sigh of relief as he let his eyes blink open. The room was empty once more, and when he looked at where Phil had been sitting while he did his stitches, he noticed a bottle of pills had been placed next to his glass of water. He lifted the bottle, noticing there were only a few pills rattling inside. When he read the label, he couldn't help the warmth that spread over the heaviness in his chest. Well, he wasn't sure who told Phil about his headaches. At least he had some painkiller to help deal with them now. I need some more water. My throat's getting dry as fuck! When the Pythia woke up the next morning, his room was still empty. As soon as the events from the day before flooded into his head, he was on his feet and stumbling to the shared door between his and Tommy's rooms. He knocked a few times, not even registering the fact that he wasn't wearing his blindfold until his fist had already hit the metal. It didn't matter, though. The seconds ticked on, but he couldn't hear anything from Tommy's side. "Tommy?" he called out, pulling his blindfold out of his pocket to tie over his eyes. "Are you in there?" Still nothing. The Pythia cursed under his breath. Phil had said he and Techno were going to talk with Tommy in the morning. That must have been where he was. Tugging the blindfold off again, he made his way to the bathroom and splashed lukewarm water over his face to wake himself up. He did his best not to get the bandage on his eyebrow wet, and gave it a light tap to see if it hurt. There was a twinge of pain, but nothing too terrible. Hopefully it would stay that way. After drying off, he made his way back into his room, and found himself at a loss for what to do. Yeah, honestly though, you would not imagine how difficult it is to, maneuver around washing your face when, something on your face is hurting, in a sense, or could potentially hurt. The amount of change that I've had to make to my face washing routine and, my face drying when coming out of the shower routine after I got an eyebrow piercing, because I don't want that shit getting caught on anything and bleeding, you know what I mean? Let's see. Usually, Tommy would either be the one to wake him up, or show up within a few minutes of him waking up. Then they would go to the cafeteria together for breakfast. But the Pythia had no idea when Tommy was coming back. While he'd gone to get food on his own since Phil had granted him permission to walk around the temple without an escort, it wasn't something he made a habit of. He didn't like being outside of his room without Tommy by his side, because it always felt like there was a nervous itch under his skin he couldn't scratch. No one in the temple would hurt him. He wasn't afraid of that. There was just something inherently wrong about him walking down those hallways by himself. Even when he knew there was no reason to feel like that. The Pythia considered his options. Wait here until Tommy came back, which could take all day for all he knew, or shove down his anxiety and get his own breakfast. His growling stomach ended up deciding for him. Why is it in this specific scenario that I just randomly get the craving for Denny's breakfast food? There's probably not even a Denny's anywhere near here, and I don't have the money for that shit. So why do I do this to myself? I hate my body. In more ways than one. Hashtag dysphoria. His trip to the cafeteria was surprisingly uneventful. It seemed like he'd woken up later than he usually did, so most of the deathlings... Hey, no worries. You never have to worry about showing up late to a stream. I always enjoy the company nonetheless. Where was I? So most of the deathlings had already cleared out for the day. Amesy, Tubba, and Rambu were the only three still eating, and while he returned the wave Amesy gave him, he didn't go out of his way to speak to the trio as he grabbed himself a few pieces of art bake and a bread roll to go. He ate as he walked back to his room. The art bake was slightly burnt, but he forced it down anyway. In case, I don't know if you've watched any of my previous streams of me reading this, but art bake means artificial bacon. This is like a cyberpunk kind of SBI AU. Let's see. following it with a soft bread that was never anything but perfect. Even if Tommy was with him, he wouldn't have stayed to eat breakfast in the cafeteria. The heaviness inside of him from yesterday was still there. It was a suffocating thing, the events from the night before flashing behind his eyes as he tried desperately to ignore the implications that were piling up around him. No problem. When he made his way back into the main chamber of the temple, the hair on the back of his neck rose as soon as he was within view of Kristen's statue. The almost smile playing across her lips felt mocking, because she knew he was choosing to stay here, in her domain, instead of going back to serve his own goddess. Even if Clara couldn't see him down here, Kristen could. He wasn't sure if that was better or worse. So focused on not looking at Kristen's statue as he walked by it, he didn't notice the person standing in front of him until a shoulder connected with his arm. "Shit!" he yelped in surprise. Rough, calloused hands reached out to steady him. "Sorry, mate. I thought you saw me." The Pythia's head snapped up to see Phil standing in front of him. Compared to the night before, the ice in Phil's eyes had melted into something far more comforting. He gave the Pythia a small smile, dropping his hands as soon as he was steady on his feet again. "No, I was kind of lost in thought," the Pythia explained, cheeks burning. "You're fine. Happens to me all the time," Phil chuckled. "How's the eye doing?" The Pythia blinked. "Oh, it's fine. Doesn't hurt that much." Phil nodded, seemingly pleased. "Good. Let me know if you bleed through your bandages or anything. The last thing we need is you getting an infection over something stupid like that." "I'll let you know," he said, folding his arms over his chest. "But actually, have you seen Tommy today? I figured he was with you, but I wasn't sure, so..." "He's with Techno right now," Phil answered, his smile fading. "I gave him a pretty long lecture this morning about how stupid he was for last night. And hammer in, Techno's supervising him while he spends the day deep cleaning the supply room and kitchen." The Pythia winced. He's gotta be bored out of his mind. Phil snorted. When I left, he'd named his cleaning rag Clementine and was talking to it like a person. Yup, sounded like Tommy. I need more water. 1 second. Yup, sounded like Tommy. "How long's he gonna be doing that for?" the Pythia asked, fighting to keep his voice neutral despite the nerves already welling up inside of him. Phil hummed. Probably most of the day. I wouldn't be surprised if Technos keeps him till dinner." Shit. While the Pythia knew it wasn't that long, he wasn't really sure what he could do to keep himself from getting too sucked into his own head while Tommy was gone. "I know it seems harsh, but I can't afford to let Tommy take risks like that. Especially not with how precarious things are at the moment," Phil continued, after seeing the Pythia's expression twist. "Because I'm here?" the Pythia asked, furrowing his brows, only to wince when it tugged at his stitches. To his surprise, Phil shook his head. "Nah, Your old news, mate. There's a lot going on in the outside world. Situations that we might be able to take advantage of. I mean, I saw one of Schlatt's TV interviews last night. It seemed like he's still talking about the ball, the Pythia pointed out. Snorting, Phil said, "Yeah, because what better way to get your citizens to ignore the other countries knocking on your door than by shining a spotlight on the cult terrorists, as you so kindly used to call us." Wait, what? Knocking on doors? What do you mean by that? I don't know the details. The news isn't reporting on much, but rumor has it that tensions are rising at the borders. Phil shrugged. It's something we're looking into. And just like that, the Pythia was reminded that while Schlatt was an idiot, he had a bit more cunning than he often gave the man credit for. Of course he would request an interview with Tina Kitten to keep the public's focus on the Deathling attack. Not only did it humanize the Emperor by putting him in the seat Tina used to interview celebrities and influencers, but it ensured that the story would reach people who avoided watching the news in favor of sticking with mindless entertainment. If the news wasn't reporting on whatever situation was happening at the border, the only way to get information about it would be through an avenue like social media. But because the types of people who use social media also often watch Tina's interviews, they would all be talking about Schlatt's interview instead. Whatever was happening at the border had to be serious if Schlatt was going to these lengths to keep attention away from it. If the Deathlings were able to take advantage of something like this, a lot of things could change in a very short period of time. Regardless of whatever Clara said his duty to the Emperor was, his hatred for Schlatt and the government he ran overrode everything else in his mind. Which meant that he was not going to worry too much about what the Deathlings' plans could be at the moment. Well, okay then. Thanks for letting me know about Tommy, the Pythia said after a moment, turning on his heel to head back to his room. Sorry, drinking more water. It's been a while since I've done a stream like this, and like I said, my throat is not happy. I'm probably gonna have some tea after this. Before he could take a step forward, though, there was a hand on his shoulder tugging him back. "Wait, where are you going?" Phil asked, turning him back around. "Remember I said I had something to show you today?" The Pythia's eyes widened. He actually had forgotten about that. "Oh, yeah," he nodded. This was fine. There was no reason for him to be worried around Phil. He knew that at this point, even if the lump in his throat seemed to suggest otherwise. Lead the way. The Pythia didn't miss the warm glint in Phil's eyes as he led him out of the main chamber and down the corridor to the bathhouse. They passed both his and Tommy's rooms, the air growing thick as steam from the cave began to roll out into the hallway. Screw it, I'm getting rid of this tag thing completely. Don't care if I mess with the stitching. I need it. It's scratching my side. I need it gone. Come on. That did nothing. Hold on. 1 second. I've realized that this stitching is probably to keep the tag in place. And since I'm trying to get rid of the tag, the stitching is useless. Yeah. These days, it's hard for me to like feel bothered by tags, at least the ones on my back, because I hardly feel them anymore. But sometimes there's tags on like the side of my shirt, or even on my back, that just slip through the cracks. Come on. Shoot. Part of the actual hemming of the shirt is coming up. I did not want that. I should have, instead of just trying to cut out the tag earlier, I should have just ripped off the whole thing like I normally do. I made this way harder on myself than it should have been. Come on. Sorry, 1 second. Oh, I think I got it. Okay, we're good. Hopefully it shouldn't bother me anymore. Like, I get the reason for tags, like, in terms of branding, but fuck, man. Let's see. Soon, but they can just be so annoying sometimes, yeah. Soon, the sound of babbling water drowned out his and Phil's footsteps, the dim glow coming from the floating lights above their heads lighting the way. Although the Pythia had a feeling they weren't going to the bathhouse, he was still surprised when Phil led him past the entrance and further down the corridor. Namely, because he thought that was where the corridor ended. It got so dark that close to the bathhouse that he'd never seen more than 4 feet beyond it. But Phil led him into the darkness without hesitation, and they only made it a few more steps before Phil stopped. The Pythia listened as Phil rustled around in his pockets. Then he made a quiet noise of triumph, and one of those smaller bug-like lights that Tommy carried floated out of his pocket. Soft purple light flickered off the stone walls of the temple corridor. The Pythia looked forward again, eyes widening when he finally saw they were standing in front of a door. The door itself was plain, made up of dark wooden panels dulled by age. The only sign that the door had been touched in the past century was the keypad embedded into a shiny metal door handle, and a few small enchantments carved into the wood above it. Phil typed a passcode into the door, before tracing the enchantment runes with his finger, the carvings lighting up in shades of purple as he did so. There was a telltale click of a door unlocking, and Phil smiled as he pushed down the handle to step through. "Welcome to the catacombs," Phil said softly, holding the door open for the Pythia. As the Pythia ducked under the doorframe to follow Phil through, he couldn't help but feel like he had the first night Tommy brought him to the temple. Or I think that's supposed to say like he had died or something. I don't know. Like he was stepping through the gates of hell and didn't have the slightest clue how he was going to find his way out. Once the door clicked shut behind him, the Pythia straightened up and found himself face to face with a human skull. "What the fuck?" he yelped, slamming his back against the door. He was surrounded by skulls. They lined the walls from floor to ceiling, hundreds of empty eye sockets staring straight through him as the purple glow from Phil's floating light flickered against their bones. Back in the days before death worship was outlawed, many people chose to be buried here in the walls of death temples to ensure Kristen would watch over them in the afterlife, he explained, eyes skimming over the remains. The Pythia sucked in a ragged breath, wincing when he realized he was probably breathing in someone's bone dust. This has been here the whole time? Phil huffed. These have been here for centuries. Mate. When Tommy had dragged him down the stairs the night of the ball, the Pythia had asked him where they were going. Even though he said the underworld thing as a joke, in the end, Tommy hadn't been joking at all. The temple was surrounded by death. It always had been. The remains of hundreds, if not thousands of people, resting just beyond the walls he'd grown so familiar with over the past few months. I know it's a bit disconcerting, but I promise there's nothing to be scared of. Phil reassured him in a quiet voice. These souls probably rest easier than anyone who's died in the past century does. Well, Phil had a point there. He had doubted those people whose ashes were disposed of because proper burial plots were practically impossible to afford these days for resting easily. Forcing himself to take another breath, the Pythia stepped away from the door and let his eyes roam over the skulls. They were still staring at him. He could feel the weight on his shoulders, but it wasn't suffocating. Not in the way he was used to stairs being. No. As his heartbeat began to slow, he let himself bask in the silence, and decided it was almost peaceful in here. How many people are buried here? The Pythia whispered. Not sure. A lot of records got destroyed when death worship was outlawed, Phil told him, the bug light buzzing by his head as he began to walk down the corridor. Stay close to me while you're in here, okay? Blinking a few times, the Pythia hurried to follow Phil. So I don't get lost? Phil snorted. This thing goes around in a circle, so I'd be impressed if you managed to get yourself lost. It's just that we don't usually allow people that aren't deathlings in here, so I'd rather you keep in my line of sight. Oh. Is that why Charlie keeps asking Tommy to get him bones from the catacombs, since he can't go in here himself? At this, Phil tipped his head back and laughed. Death below. Charlie's still on that shit? When the Pythian nodded, he shook his head. Fucking weirdo. He's a great guy, but at this point, I think he's just doing the bone bit to fuck with people. Tommy bribed him with a tooth last night so he wouldn't tell Quackity about us leaving the temple, the Pythia said. Phil's smile disappeared. A real tooth. Tommy said it was an old one of his own that he held on to. Considering this for a moment, Phil grimaced. Maybe it's not a bit then. The Pythia decided not to tell Phil about the time he tried to bribe Charlie with bones to help him escape. They continued down the corridor, and it was only when the Pythia tore his eyes away from the skulls lining the walls that he noticed there was another light source besides the bug floating by Phil's head. Excuse me. The floors and ceiling were made of that same stone Kristen's statue in the main chamber was made of. The dark gray kind with lighter flecks that glittered like stars against a night sky. Proper stars were painted over the stone as well, though. Unlike the starry ceiling in the chamber outside of Nikki's tattoo parlor in Ponk's infirmary, these stars weren't based off of real constellations. Instead, these stars created spiraling patterns that sometimes repeated, sometimes didn't. They spun into each other, the paint glowing bright enough that the Pythia could probably walk through it even without Phil's additional light. Did you guys paint these? The Pythia asked, trailing his fingers along the cool stone ceiling. Phil shook his head. I went over with glowing paint so it could provide more light, but we didn't add anything that wasn't already there. The original Deathlings gave the souls resting here stars to be buried in, and we didn't want to disturb that. It was beautiful. The Pythia had thought that about most of the paintings he'd seen throughout the temple so far, but nothing could quite compare to the stars burning amongst the dead. He even preferred it to the starry ceiling outside of Nikki's parlor. Because while those stars did a fantastic job mimicking real constellations, these stars weren't trying to replicate the living world. The land of the dead had its own sky. For some reason, the Pythia found this comforting. The corridor began to curve. The skulls stacked carefully to curve with it as he and Phil continued making their way through the catacombs. He tried to imagine where they were in relation to the temple itself. If it was like Phil had described, and the catacombs formed a giant circle around the temple, he was fairly sure they would be passing by the bedrooms at this point. He wanted to be freaked out now that he knew he'd slept only a wall away from thousands of dead bodies, but with the stars twinkling both above his head and below his feet, and blessedly cool air wrapping around his shoulders, he couldn't be freaked out if he tried. It was too calm here. Their footsteps didn't echo as they walked. The walls continued to curve, and soon, the Pythian knew they had to be reaching the Adyton, which he still just thought of as Phil's office. Suddenly, Phil stopped again. This part of the corridor was so curved, the Pythia couldn't see what was beyond the turn, and Phil turned around to face him again. Only deathlings can cross the veil to pray to Kristen. But considering your position as the Pythia, I'll allow you to stand right outside it, Phil explained, his hands folded behind his back. There was a warning lying under his words that he didn't need to say out loud for the Pythia to understand. Don't do anything to disrespect her while you're in here. The Pythia nodded, and hoped Phil knew he heard both messages. While he hadn't been the most respectful of Kristen in the past, even he would never dare to speak badly of a deity so close to their domain. Phil's shoulders loosened ever so slightly, and the Pythia had a feeling he understood. They followed the curve of the wall, coming to a straight stretch of corridor where the two halves of the circle met. And Kristen stood right in the center of it all. Along the floor and across the ceiling, the stars spiraled into a circle around the base and above the head of Kristen's statue. While this statue was much smaller than the one in the main chamber of the temple, it was still slightly taller than he was. And he felt the hair on the back of his neck rise as soon as he was within Kristen's field of view. Don't cross this line, Phil instructed, gesturing to a place where the stars on the ground formed a line a few feet away from the statue. Staying silent, he took a step back from the line, and Phil nodded. Then he watched as Phil shut his eyes and stepped over the line himself. There was no ripple in the air or hint of a shimmering veil, but the change in Phil was immediate. All the tension in his body lifted away. His features relaxed, and his breaths were steady as he approached the statue. Unlike the statue in the main chamber of the temple, this one depicted Kristen holding her hands out in front of her with the palms up. Phil was silent as he rested his hands on her own, staring up at Kristen's face for a few long moments, before moving his hands away to reach into his pocket. Okay, so it's not just mentions of minor self-harm in a religious form, as I thought it would be. It looks like he's going to actually do it. So, if this triggers anybody watching, please keep yourselves safe first. The Pythia's mouth went dry as Phil wrapped his fingers around the glittering black hilt of a small dagger. Suddenly, breathing became a challenge as he watched Phil bring the point of the dagger to the ring finger of his left hand. He had to stifle a sharp breath as Phil pressed the blade into his finger and watched Phil's face for any sign of pain. To his surprise, though, Phil didn't even blink twice. He looked completely at ease as blood welled up from the tip of his finger, and he pocketed the dagger once more, before angling his hand over one of Kristen's. Using his uninjured hand, he squeezed a few drops of blood into Kristen's palm. Then Phil let out a deep breath and rose up to his tiptoes so he could press his forehead against the statues. He murmured something to Kristen in a voice too low for the Pythia to hear. A few moments passed, and then Phil smiled, letting out a quiet laugh before saying something else. Behind the Pythia's blindfold, his eyes began to burn. Because despite the blood smeared across his palm, Phil was happy. His smile was incandescent. His words were impossibly warm. It was completely absent of the desperation he felt every time he prayed to Clara. The dread that sat deep in the pit of his stomach, telling him that one day she would realize she'd made a mistake choosing him. That if he didn't prove himself to her, his entire existence would be defined as a failure. Phil didn't need to prove himself to Kristen. Maybe he already had, or maybe she'd never asked for that in the first place. As his vision blurred, his throat began to close up. He dug his nails into his palms to try and distract himself. But his breathing grew quicker, and the weight of the skull surrounding him was suffocating him. He brought a hand to his mouth to stifle the sound of his tears, but in the dead silence of the catacombs, it rang out like a bell. Phil whipped around, eyes going wide the second they landed on him. Pythia? He opened his mouth to try and tell Phil he was fine, but instead, all that came out was a strangled sob. Oh fuck, Phil muttered as he rushed over. Now in front of him, Phil's hands hovered over his arms, like he wanted to reach out but wasn't sure if he should. I'm sorry, he stammered out, curling in on himself to try and contain the flood of emotion spilling out from his insides. You don't need to apologize, Phil reassured him. What's going on? What's wrong? Fighting for air, he heard his bird's shrieks echo in his ears and winced because it was crying out in his own voice. It's different, he forced out between gasps. How you are around Kristen it's different from how I am with Clara. Phil narrowed his eyes. How so? He felt tears get caught in his blindfold, with a few escaping to roll down his cheeks, visible in the dim light. You're good enough for her, he whispered. Phil's face plummeted. Oh. Taking a step back, Phil looked him up and down, like he was seeing him for the first time. Then his hands were reaching out again, but still hovered in the space between them. Can I touch you? When he nodded, Phil moved to grab his forearms, but as soon as he had that tiny bit of physical contact, he found himself collapsing completely against Phil. Phil grunted in surprise, but didn't hesitate to wrap his arms around his back. It wasn't the same as hugging Tommy. When he hugged Tommy, it was like the frequency constantly buzzing under his skin had finally found its match. The buzzing was overwhelming, but overwhelming in a way that drowned out all his other worries. The kind of overwhelming that canceled itself out, but didn't at the same time. In contrast, Phil was steady, quiet, almost like he was the statue in the room. Almost like he was the statue in the room, and not the statue of Kristen that sat against the opposite wall. When he hugged Phil, everything in his head went silent, even the shrieking bird. Unlike the time Tommy had helped him through his panic attack in the bathhouse, Wilbur didn't break down into sobs as Phil hugged him. Instead, his breathing began to slow, and he slumped further into Phil's hold as the weight of the stairs bearing down on him became too much all at once. The skulls were watching him. Kristen was watching him. Clara wasn't watching him. Wilbur didn't care about any of them. Even as his cries went quiet, his shoulders still shook, and he twisted his fingers into the front of Phil's shirt as Phil slowly lowered them to the ground. They stayed quiet like that for a while. They stayed like that for quite a while. Phil traced circles into his back as his shaking began to slow, before his hand moved up to gently squeeze the back of his neck. Phil's palms were still rough, and although he hadn't let himself lean into it the night before, this time he did. When the tears had mostly dried with only the occasional sniffle to remind him they were there in the first place, Wilbur knew it was time to pull away. But seconds turned into minutes, and Phil made no moves to push him back, so he stayed where he was. Phil was the first to speak. I remember hearing that the new Pythia had been chosen around a decade ago, Phil said, his voice soft. How old were you when that happened? On another day, he would have battled with himself more about telling the leader of the Deathlings something the Pythia wasn't supposed to share. But on this day, Wilbur was in the heart of the Death Temple's catacombs. Kristen's eyes were focused on him. He was being comforted by her head acolyte. Besides, he'd already told Tommy, and Phil saw his face anyway, so it's not like it mattered. But the nerves inside of him weren't just because of the taboo he was breaking. It was that after this, Phil would know how young he'd been when he was chosen. After this, Phil would look at him and know he was only a few years older than his own son. Although he didn't understand why, another part of him wanted to tell Phil that precisely for that reason. 12. Wilbur confessed, his voice muffled by the shirt. Phil sucked in a sharp breath. So you're only 22, he whispered, and Wilbur didn't miss the horror in his words. Wilbur nodded, and although the hand on the back of his neck stayed put, he felt another cool hand brush through his hair. Fuck, Phil muttered. You were 12. His chest squeezed, and he slumped further against Phil as the cool hand continued to run through his hair. Sighing, he tried to press his head further into comforting touch, only for it to pull away. He waited for it to come back. Then he realized Phil had one hand on the back of his neck, and the other wrapped around his shoulders. Neither of his hands had moved in the past 5 minutes. Meaning that the hand that brushed through his hair wasn't Phil's? What the? Kristen? Lifting his head away from Phil's shoulder, Wilbur glanced behind him and found he couldn't see the statue's eyes from where he was sitting. Even still, he could feel her watching him. Wait. Hold on. Before this moment, anytime that there was like a capitalized she, it was always in reference to Clara, the goddess that Wilbur was supposedly a prophet for. Now it's a capitalized her in reference to Kristen when that's never been like that before. Character development! Sorry, I love writing! I love reading good writing! A chill ran down his spine even though he wasn't cold in the slightest. And that's how the chapter ends. Fuck you, but also, I love this. Lord. I love when Bones and the Bees, the author of this story, I love when in like the notes section says, I've been waiting to write about this, like, insert specific scene here since I posted the first chapter. You know, like, because that just really goes to show that, like, this was supposed to be like a pivotal moment. This was the climax of the story. How many more chapters are in this, actually? There's 11 more. There's still 11 more after this. I'm literally gonna find this B. B, no. Oh Lord, I cannot wait. This is why I was so excited to read this story, because I am such a sucker. I am a sucker for religious trauma in media. I may be a bit biased, but did they write that one Tommy and its Clinic for Supervillains? Yes, she did. Hold on, let me just make sure that her pronouns haven't changed since I last. Hold on. Okay, still she, her. Okay, I didn't accidentally misgender her. What did you say the title was? Tommy and its Clinic for Supervillains. That was, I've read 2 superhero AUs and I never remember what they're called. Oh, fuck. Didn't you literally, like, watch some of my streams of me reading it? Oh, yeah. Reading, I will never forget reading Clinic live on stream. Dude, what? I will tell you something. What? What did I do? Pray tell, what did I do? Don't shoot the messenger, buddy. Just saying. You made me start reading fanfiction. I don't even read it that often. I only read it on stream these days. That's crazy. Actually, your fault. Lord almighty. Alright. I read one of Bones' fics because you were, and I had to catch up. Ah, true. I remember you. It all got worse from there. I love like I love that emote. The part Rambu P Desolate, yeah. I want emotes one day, but I don't have the money to commission anyone at the moment, and I guess I could like have like silly little doodles. I could do silly little doodles. But anyways, fuck you. Okay. Alright. Awesome. Alright, let's find someone to raid. Because there's no way I'm like, you know the drill. I only read like a chapter of these because they're so long. My throat would actually die if I went any further. Let's see. Who's live right now? Alright, go on then. I have more than 15 tabs open. You sound like that was what I would do. I had like the first fic that you ever read, the first fan fiction you ever read was Passerin. Ever. Ever? I've been on the internet too long. I've been on the internet for far too long. I think, I'm trying to think. What was the first fic I ever read? I don't even remember. I think it had something to do with Harry Potter. No, I know it ain't your fault. I know it's not your fault. I didn't have social media. Like, I wasn't allowed to have social media. I didn't have Facebook until I was 13. I really only did things through Google+, and then behind my parents' back, I installed social media apps when I was like 14 years old. But I think, yeah, the first fic I ever read had something to do with Harry Potter. I think it was, Harry Potter... Not what? Nothing. Listen, Google Plus was the only thing my parents would let me have when I was 12, okay? Listen, I was a naive 14-year-old. I was a naive 14-year-old. This was back when I thought that the only form of fanfiction that there was smut, okay? So, of course, later on I learned that that's not the case, but the internet was a different time back then. I'm gonna stop talking. Let's raid someone, shall we? Let's raid Sneak. Let's raid... Shut up! Brett, shut up. Shush. You shut your mouth. Let's raid Sneak. It'll only go uphill from here shortly. Yeah, just like my start to the school year. I lost an earring on the first day of classes in the grass. My first time ever wearing them. I had a meltdown, and you're going to L that? Ableist! No, I'm kidding. Alright, I'm gonna head out. I'm gonna have some tea, and I'm going to chill and probably play some Minecraft or something. Or watch YouTube, or both. In retrospect, that is rather funny. They didn't have backs to them, and it was windy, and I was scootering to work, and it flew out of my ear. Anyway, I hope you guys have a great rest of your night, or day, or whatever time zone it is. Don't say it in chat. I will ban you. I'll ban you. I'll do it. Follow me on my other socials, if you want. no pressure. You can find them there. Okay, the raid's about to happen. Gonna end stream. All right, bye.